Thank you for returning. It means so much to me. I know you really wanted to go on TikTok or really do anything but do this. So I appreciate you. Back to it. We just did the miscellaneous tips and tricks. Now let's do the thing we're here for, the structure of a short story, the inverted claw. As I said at the beginning of the lesson, this structure outlines all the essential ingredients that make up a great short story. If you include each ingredient in your story, you'll impress the marker. It's really that simple. So let's see what this structure looks like. Firstly, why is it called the inverted claw? Great question. This kind of looks like a claw. It looks like this if we flip it horizontally, and it looks like this if we invert it. Hence the inverted claw. The inverted claw short story structure, that is a mouthful, consists of 4 parts. Part 1 is a title. Part 2 is the beginning. Part 3 is the middle, and part 4 is the end. Each part, except the title, has at least one section. The beginning has the exposition. The middle has the background, the rising action, and the climax. And the end has the resolution. And within each section, we've got at least one element. The exposition has 3 elements. Firstly, characters. Secondly, setting. Thirdly, action. The background has 2 elements. First one is the trigger and the second one is the conflict. The rising action just has the one element, which is the setback. The climax just has the finale and the resolution just has the aftermath. So you know how I said a moment ago that we've got all of these ingredients and these ingredients make up a great short story? Well, all of these elements are those ingredients that make up a great, captivating, engaging short story. As we can see, the exposition section and the background section have more than one element. The background has 2 and the exposition has 3. You can address these elements in any order you want, provided they remain in their respective sections. So for the background, you can refer to the trigger first, then the conflict, or you can do the conflict and then the trigger. Doesn't matter. For the exposition, you can do action, character, setting, characters, action, whatever. One other thing that's really important to note about this structure is, with the exception of section 2, the exposition, the plot is linear. Section 1, section 3, section 4, and section 5, they are linear. They move forward in time in one straight line. Section 2, the background section, is non-linear. It moves backwards in time in a curve. And we go back to a point before the exposition and explain something that led us to the exposition. Hence this dotted line at the bottom being straight to represent the linear nature of time. So this structure forms the basis of the short stories that we'll be analyzing and you'll be composing over this lesson and the following 4. Let's talk about each part of this structure in more detail, starting with the title. How should we formulate it? Well, the title should hint at or refer to any combination of the following aspects of your story: a theme or idea. For example, Django Unchained. The word unchained hints at Django's emancipation, which means his becoming a free man, and the theme of freedom. So your title should hint at or refer to a theme or a title. It can also hint at or refer to a character, like we just saw. Another example for this one is Captain Marvel. The movie is called Captain Marvel. It is the main character's name. The third thing your title could hint at or refer to is a plot point. For example, Dark Knight Rises. In that movie, Batman literally rises from this pit. It is a major plot point of the movie. Note that this title also obviously refers to the character's name, and it also refers to the theme of resilience, being able to bounce back after something. That's how we formulate our title. Consider using, hinting, referring to one or more of the following: theme or idea, character, plot point. That's part 1 of our short story structure. Our second part is the beginning, and it contains one section, the exposition. As you will recall, this is what the relevant section of the inverted claw looks like. And we also know the exposition consists of 3 elements. Firstly, characters, then setting, and then action. Remember that those 3 elements can be ordered in any way. The overarching purpose of this section is to immediately capture the audience's attention by starting in media res, which means in the middle of the action. Let's have a quick chat about each of the elements of this section of the story, starting with characters. The specific purpose of this subsection is to introduce the characters of the story to the reader. That's what we want to do, and this is how we should do it. We should establish who the protagonist is, who the antagonist is, which could be the protagonist, him, her, themselves, another character, or society or nature. By the way, antagonist is just the villain, the bad guy. We should also establish any other characters. That's our first task. This is our second task. Use a combination of the conventions of characterization to introduce each character. Recall the lesson on characterization in Module 2. I have no doubt you have already memorized all those conventions of characterization, and there is no point in me putting them back up here on the slides, but hey, it doesn't hurt to be 100% certain. So here are those conventions of characterization that I know you already know. That's one of the subsections of the exposition, characters. Another subsection is setting. The specific purpose of this subsection is to depict the environment in which the story takes place, the setting. Our task, should we choose to accept it, is consider and utilize the aspects of setting to construct a world that complements the plot. What are the aspects of setting? Well, we've got time, place, and mood. Regarding time, use the following metrics to help you determine the time in which your story takes place. Historical period, year, season, month, day, time of day, etc. Also, consider the relevance of social conditions of the time you choose. For example, if a story took place in 1940, you would probably refer to World War II and the implications of it on your plot. Regarding place, the geographical location might be specific. For example, Perth, general, for example, Australia, or undisclosed. For example, an island in the southern hemisphere. One other thing regarding the place. Consider the impact, if any, of weather or climate conditions of the place you choose. For example, if a story is set in the desert, you might refer to the lack of water or how hot it is. Finally, a few notes about mood. This is another one I have no doubt in my mind that you can recall perfectly when you did that lesson in Module 2. But just to erase all doubt, we already know mood refers to the feeling created by a text. My question to you is, what feeling or feelings can you create to complement the plot? I also know that you can recall perfectly the features that you can utilize to create a mood in a written text. We've got diction, figurative language, imagery, setting, syntax, and tone. Okay, that is the setting subsection of the exposition. The third and final one that we're looking at is the action element. The specific purpose of this section is to underscore the protagonist's mission. Our tasks are, firstly, illustrate the relationship between the characters and the setting. Essentially, we illustrate that relationship by asking ourselves, what are the characters doing in the setting? Note that it is this action that marks the beginning of a path that ends at the resolution. This is what sets the protagonist in motion on the inverted claw short story structure all the way to the resolution. Your other task is to ensure the reader knows what the protagonist wants to achieve. This creates tension in the plot because the reader is told the protagonist wants something that he, she, they can't have or they don't have yet. So there's a tension in what the protagonist's current situation is and what their ideal situation is. And by letting the reader in on that tension, we become engaged and gripped by the story and want to see what happens when that tension is relieved. Cool. That is the structure of part 1, the beginning, section 1, the exposition, and those 3 elements of the exposition. Characters, setting, and action. Let's take a look at part 3, the middle and the background section specifically. This section has 2 elements or 2 subsections. One of them is the trigger and the other one is the conflict. Remember, I can refer to either of these elements in any order: conflict first or conflict last. The overarching purpose of this section is to provide some background info that explains how the characters arrived in the situation outlined in the exposition. As already explained, this involves going back in time to explain something that leads us to this point in the story. So some ways you can achieve that is by using a shift in time and place, an embedded narrative, a story within a story, or through character recollection and or character dialogue. That's an overview of this section, the background. Here is a bit of an explanation of each element of it, looking at the trigger first. The specific purpose of this subsection is to justify the protagonist's mission. We can do that by indicating what the protagonist's trigger was that led them to end up in the situation that was outlined in the exposition. It would probably help to know exactly what a trigger is, and essentially it's an event that causes or triggers a protagonist to do something. A couple of examples. Dog is murdered. Trigger, kills everyone. What the protagonist does as a result. Secret identity is revealed to the world. Unleashes the multiverse. What the protagonist does as a result. Diagnosed with cancer. Trigger, cooks meth. What the protagonist does as a result. That is the trigger element. This is the conflict element. The specific purpose of this subsection is to highlight the obstacle the protagonist must overcome in order to accomplish their mission. We've got two tasks here. Our first one is to introduce the protagonist conflict, and the second one is to ensure the nature of the conflict explains why the protagonist was in the situation outlined in the exposition. One thing that requires some explanation here is the types of conflict we can have in a story. I alluded to this a few minutes ago, but let's tackle it directly head on. There are two overarching types of conflict. The first type is internal, and one subtype of an internal conflict is the character versus himself, herself, themself. The protagonist experiences a psychological struggle caused by their own emotions, fears, limitations, desires, mental illness, etc. An example is Hamlet's psychological struggle regarding the death of his father. Hamlet's conflicted regarding whether someone murdered his father, whether to seek revenge, and how to seek revenge. That's internal conflicts. Then we've got external conflicts, of which we have three types. The first subtype is character versus character. This is when you've got two characters with opposing perspectives who are at odds with each other. For example, Harry Potter's rivalry with Lord Voldemort. The next subtype is character versus society. This is when the protagonist is pitted against the broader forces of society. In this case, society might be personified in one or more characters who act as a symbol for society's ideals. For example, Winston's rebellion against Big Brother in the book and movie 1984. Final subtype is character versus nature. This is where the protagonist is threatened by a natural force, such as an animal, infectious disease, natural disaster, etc. Example, in the movie Into the Wild, the protagonist, Christopher McCandless, donates all his money to charity and decides to live in the Alaskan wilderness. In this case, the protagonist's conflict is with the Alaskan wilderness, nature. Good stuff. That is the background section of part 3 of the inverted claw short story structure. And that is the two elements of this section, the trigger and the conflict. Let's turn to the next section of part 3, the rising action. We've got some purple. There's not much purple in EAMS, so I thought, why not? Let's have some purple for the rising action. You'll recall from our overview of the inverted claw that the rising action section has one element, or ingredient. That ingredient is the setback. We'll turn to a more in-depth discussion of the setback in a second, but first, let's address what the overarching purpose of this section is. That purpose is to build tension and develop the plot towards the climax. Okay, now we can have that in-depth discussion on the setback. What is this thing all about? The specific purpose of it is as follows. It is to convey to the reader that the protagonist is a real, imperfect human who experiences setbacks. Note that doing this, conveying the protagonist's imperfections, in turn makes that protagonist more relatable. So that is what we're trying to do in the setback, but how do we do it? We do it by creating an event in the plot that only just defeats the protagonist. What do you mean by that? You know what? I'm sorry. It probably would have helped to know what the setback is, right? Yes, you idiot. What is the setback, the namesake of this subsection? The setback is the protagonist's first attempt at achieving what they have set out to do at the beginning of the story. It's called the setback because one of the following happens. An action has an unintended outcome. For example, in The Dark Knight Rises, Batman pursues Bane, but Bane defeats him, leading to Batman's imprisonment in the pit. Another thing that can happen in the setback is a complication arises. For example, in our favorite movie, Avengers Endgame, evil Nebula infiltrates the Avengers facility and enables Thanos to time travel. One more common instance of a setback is a character making a mistake. Example, in Catch Me If You Can, Frank Abagnale Jr., played by Leo, prints fake checks using a unique type of printer that ultimately enables an FBI agent to track him down. And the FBI agent was Hollywood's nicest man, other than Keanu Reeves, Tom Hanks. Relevantly, the protagonist learns something due to this setback, whatever it is, and that thing proves helpful in the climax. Coming back to The Dark Knight Rises. Because of Batman's setback in the pit, he learns the values of patience and resilience. Lovely work. Let's keep this train chugging along to another section. It is the last section in the middle part of the inverted claw, the climax. What color is this one again? Oh, well. We like a bit of red these days, don't we? Just like the rising action, the climax has the one element, the one ingredient, the finale. The overarching purpose of the climax is to illustrate the most intense, exciting, and pivotal part of the entire plot. Let's have a quick chat about the finale element. Starting with the specific purpose of this subsection, and that is simply to heighten tension and suspense. How do we heighten the tension and suspense? One way to do it is to create an event in the plot that is similar but sufficiently different from the setback, where the protagonist narrowly defeats the antagonist and achieves their mission. A few explanatory points about the finale. Firstly, consider it as the protagonist's second attempt at achieving what they set out to do at the beginning of the story. This time, having learned a valuable lesson from their first failed attempt, the protagonist prevails by confronting and defeating the antagonist. Note, if the protagonist doesn't grow from the setback, there's no reason for the outcome of the second attempt to be any different from the first. Also, the reader will be more engaged if the protagonist faces a strong possibility of failure, despite their growth from the setback. Example. Recall that moment in Avengers Endgame, immediately before the entire Wakandan army walks through Doctor Strange's portals to assist Cap in the battle against Thanos. Cap is limping towards Thanos' entire army alone with a bruised face and a broken shield. So the Wakandan army's surprise entrance captivated the audience because the Avengers faced a strong possibility of failure before it. Put differently, consider what this finale would have been like had the Wakandan reinforcements arrived once Thanos had already been defeated. Black Panther, RIP, would have been like, hey guys, what did we miss? I don't rate it. Anywho, let's move on. That is the finale element of the climax. And that's the final section of the middle part of our story. Let's turn to the final section of the end part of our story, the resolution. And like the previous two sections, the resolution has just the one element, the one ingredient, the aftermath. If we think about what the overarching purpose of this section could be, we'd probably come up with something along the following lines. Briefly, bring the story to a close. So the resolution is to resolve the story, to briefly bring it to a close. What is the point of the aftermath element? In this element, we want to conclude with a happy ending that elicits a sense of relief and closure in the reader. In order to achieve this purpose, we have three tasks. Task number one is to enable the protagonist to reflect on the climax and the consequences of it. Task two, affirm the protagonist's success and growth. You want the reader to feel like your protagonist has gone from point A to point B in a figurative sense. They have grown as a result of the experience of the plot. Otherwise, the reader can't help but feel like they've wasted their time investing so much of it into a story, into a character that doesn't really go anywhere. Our third task is to reiterate the plot's overarching theme per step 7 of the planning steps that we will be looking at next lesson. Those are the 3 things we want to do in the aftermath element. Here are a few explanatory notes about it. You might want to bear this one in mind for later on in EAMS. The affirmation of transformation is when the protagonist, who could that be, realizes they have changed for the better. In Star Wars, the original one from 1977, Obi-Wan Kenobi assures Luke that the Force will always be with him. Also, Luke is awarded a medal for his bravery in helping destroy the Death Star. By the way, in case you haven't connected these dots yet, the affirmation of transformation is one of our 3 tasks in the aftermath element. This is how we can convey that transformation to the reader, to our marker. Narratorial commentary, the protagonist's thoughts or actions, the protagonist's dialogue with another character, or an event that recognizes the protagonist's accomplishment or accomplishments, like the ceremony where Luke Skywalker is awarded a medal for bravery. And that is the structure of a short story, the inverted claw. Couple of reminders before we compare text type structures. Don't forget about the title. Your short story should have one. It is conventional. Your marker will not be impressed if your short story does not have a title. Another thing to bear in mind is that each section of the short story moves forwards in time, except for the background, which moves back in time to contextualize what we see in media res in the exposition. Let's turn to the final main part of this lesson, a comparison of text type structures. Thank you very much. I don't know about you, but I would be a mess without color. Not going to go into agonizing detail about everything in this table, just going to highlight the main things regarding short stories. If you've already watched the structure lesson for persuasive speeches or blog posts, you would have already seen a comparison table similar to this. As I said in that lesson, I'll say it again in this lesson, you will be looking at this comparison table through a different lens, knowing you are studying imaginative texts over the next few lessons. I promise you won't regret it. Starting with the title for each of these 4 text types. Essay doesn't have one. Persuasive speech, it does. And it consists of the title, subtitle, and byline. Blog posts, it does. It is section 0. It consists of the headline, the byline, the comments, and the topics. Final text type is our short stories. It has a title, and that title alludes to a theme or an idea, a character, and or a plot point. Let's take a look at the intro or beginning section of the different text types. An essay has an introduction, and the elements of that introduction are general statement, transition to text, plot synopsis, terminology, body paragraphs, thesis. A persuasive speech also has an introduction. The theme of that introduction is ethos, activate, introduce, contextualize, reasons, thesis. The blog post, it's section 1, the introduction, activate, relevance, outline. And for our short story, we've got the beginning, which consists of the exposition as the main section, the only section, and its elements are characters, setting, and action in no particular order. Then we've got the body paragraphs or middle sections of the text types. For an essay, we've got BP1, it's teal. For a persuasive speech, we've got reason 1, logos is the theme, and tealt are the elements. Blog post, section 2, main idea 1, it uses imaginative language features, it's got a heading. Its subsections are idea, example, explain. For our short story, we've got the first section of the middle part. It's the background. It consists of the trigger element and the conflict element. Still in the middle part of the text types, for an essay, same as BP1, BP2 is a teal paragraph. For a persuasive speech, the next paragraph is reason 2, the theme is logos, elements are tealt. Blog post, section 3, main idea 2, uses persuasive language features. It's got a heading. Elements are idea, example, explain, quote. For our short story, the section is the rising action. The ingredient is the setback. Final section of the middle part or body paragraphs of these text types. For an essay, BP3, teal, structure. For a persuasive speech, it is the counter-argument, reason 3 paragraph. The theme is pathos. The elements are to real. Blog post, we've got section 4, main idea 3, uses a blend of imaginative and persuasive language features. It's got a heading. The elements are idea, examples, explain. Lastly, the short story, the section is the climax and the ingredient is the finale. Finally, final part of all the text types, for an essay, it is the conclusion. We've got thesis, terminology, body paragraphs, general statement. For a persuasive speech, also the conclusion, the theme is kairos. We have thesis, reasons, call to action, general statement. Blog post, section 5, the conclusion, got a heading, elements, summary, call to action. For a short story, we have the resolution as the section and the aftermath as the element. Woohoo! Comparison of text type structures completed. I've personally found this comparison table useful in remembering the different text type structures in EAMS, and I really hope that you do too. That is a pleasant note to wrap it up. Let's simply summarize all the content that we have addressed in this part and the first part on one page in the PDF study notes and over a few slides in this PowerPoint. All right, what have we got here? Oh yes, the type of imaginative text we're studying. Short story. After that, we had a chat about some miscellaneous tips and tricks when it comes to writing short stories. Not the most fun, but you know as well as I do, it was pretty important. Those tips and tricks were grouped into 6 different themes, the first of which was language. Tip number 1, show, don't tell by using imagery. Tip number 2, don't overuse figurative language. Next theme of tips and tricks concerned grammar. Tip 1, avoid accidental shifts in tense. Tip 2, manipulate syntax for dramatic effect by utilizing fragmented sentences and stream of consciousness sentences. Next theme of tips and tricks was all about punctuation. Tip number 1, keep dialogue punctuation inside quotation marks. Tip 2, use ellipses to indicate that a character's words are trailing off. Tip 3, use dashes to indicate that a character's words are being cut off. Tip 4, use commas to punctuate dialogue tags except when the dialogue trails off through the use of an ellipsis. Is exclamatory or interrogative? Interrogative? Tip 5, use full stops to punctuate action tags. However, use a comma when using an action tag and a dialogue tag. Tip 6, always start a section of dialogue with a capital letter, but use lowercase to continue dialogue that is interrupted by a tag. Next theme of tips and tricks, characters. Importantly, only have 2 to 3 characters in your short story. One of those characters must be the protagonist, and that character must grow. Next tip and trick concerns the plot. Tip number 1, focus on a single time, place, and action. Tip number 2, don't include a plot twist unless it is foreshadowed. 6th and final theme of tips and tricks relates to paragraphing. It's just the one tip. It is start a new paragraph line when you change time or location, start a new topic, or shift speakers. Those miscellaneous tips and tricks were the subject of part 1. The subject of part 2, this video that you are just about to finish, was the structure of a short story, The Inverted Claw. Our first subpart of this part of the lesson was how to formulate the title. The title of your short story should allude to one or more of the following aspects of it: a theme or idea, a character, and or a plot point. After that, we discussed the structure of the exposition, the beginning part of the story. The overarching purpose of the exposition is to captivate the audience by starting in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of the action. The exposition has 3 elements or ingredients. One of them is characters. In this ingredient of the story, we use conventions of characterization to introduce the protagonist, the antagonist, and any other characters such as the protagonist's guide or sidekick. Another element or ingredient of the exposition is the setting. Here we utilize the aspects of setting, which are time, place, and mood, to construct a world that complements the plot. Final element or ingredient of the exposition is the action. Here we illustrate the relationship between the characters and the setting and ensure the readers knows what the protagonist wants to achieve. In other words, what the protagonist's mission is. After that, we moved to the first section of the middle part of the story, which is the background. The overarching purpose of which is to provide background info that contextualizes the exposition. One element of the background is the trigger. The trigger indicates what caused or triggered the protagonist to end up in the situation outlined in the exposition. The last element of the background is the conflict. This ingredient highlights the obstacle the protagonist must overcome, and really that obstacle refers to an internal or external conflict, to accomplish their mission. We then turned to the next section of the middle part of the short story, illustrate the rising action. Overarching purpose, build tension and develop the plot towards the climax. The rising action has one ingredient, one element, which is the setback. The setback creates an event, usually an unintended outcome, a complication, or a mistake, in the plot that narrowly defeats the protagonist. Final section of the middle part of the short story is the climax. Overarching purpose, illustrate the most pivotal aspect of the entire story. The climax has the one element, which is the finale. This is where you create an event whereby the protagonist faces a strong possibility of failure and ultimately defeats the antagonist and achieves their mission. Finally, the structure of the resolution, which is the one and only section in the end part of our short story. The overarching purpose of the resolution is to briefly bring the story to a close. It's got the one element and it's called the aftermath. Here we enable the protagonist to reflect on the climax, underscore the affirmation of transformation, and reiterate the plot's overarching theme. After we outlined the structure of a short story, the inverted claw, we had a discussion of the text type structures and we compared them in that table, the full version of which is reproduced in the PDF study notes for this lesson. And that is all for this lesson. Hopefully the task of writing a short story seems less daunting now that you've learned that a short story is basically just a recipe with a bunch of essential ingredients. Speaking of ingredients, the workbook activities for this lesson have 2 ingredients. First class segue. The first part focuses on revising language features, and the second part gets you to practice some creative writing by focusing on different types of sensory imagery. Make sure you read the instructions carefully, as always. And that is all from me. I will see you later. Until then, keep it simple.